In Jane Schoenbrun's 2024 film I Saw the TV Glow, our protagonist's childhood friend returns to their hometown to share an important truth. The world they think they live in is a false one, a prison built to slowly kill them, and she knows how to get back to reality. All they have to do is bury themselves alive.
I bought a coffin. I dug a hole. I got inside, and I closed the lid. I screamed as loud as I could for help. I apologized for the whole thing, and I begged God for someone to come along and save me. And then I was at the surface, gasping for air. And I was me.
In the dream space of speculative fiction, it is possible for something to be both a coffin and a refuge, both a death and a liberation. Tara's self-burial is a metaphor for coming into a trans identity, and it is also literal suicidality. And it being literal bolsters the metaphor too. Being trans is not a death sentence, but the emotional truth being communicated is that it can feel like it is. As an audience member, I recognize that it is a horrifying thing she is asking her friend to do, in a way I wouldn't if she was talking about queerness as queerness. The contradiction is part of the point.
I know it's scary. That's part of it.
I start here because Interview with the Vampire is a show that parallels vampirism with COVID and with Nazis. It's a story that is interested in the relationships people have with violence. And also,
when they all pounced on that woman, drained her right in front of their dumb faces, tell me you did not feel pride, vampire pride.
This show feels of a piece to me with particular strands of contemporary queer media, the kind of thing I'm used to seeing in niche internet art and books from small presses, but still find myself shocked when it shows up in a television project with, like, a special effects budget. It's the sense that characters are queer by default, but also the particularities of the interpersonal dynamics at hand. Like,
you bold fuck, Lestat.
In a community as small as ours, such crossings of immortal paths is expected, perhaps more common.
You know, the first season of the show follows Louis as he falls in and out of love with the vampire Lestat, and one of the early issues in their relationship is around exclusivity.
We're communicating so much better now, no?
And no, they're not. He decides they should have an open relationship. Both of them have complicated feelings on the matter, and they don't discuss it further. Later, Louis tells Lestat to end things with his paramour Antoinette, and that's why him continuing to see her is a betrayal, not just that Lestat is seeing someone else. Interview with the Vampire is willing to engage with the messy interpersonal realities of stepping outside of assumed monogamous norms, without it ever feeling like it's condemning the non-monogamy itself. In season 2, Louis and Armand come into conflict over the question of what kind of relationship they even have. When we accept that these categories are arbitrary, how do you draw the line between friendship, romance, eternal vampiric companionship? The 2020s TV adaptation of Interview with the Vampire is hyper-conscious of not being the only version of this story. In-universe, this interview happening in 2022 in Dubai is a follow-up to one that happened in San Francisco in 1973. The implication being that the first more resembled the version of the story told in the original novel and the 1994 movie. For some reason, the impression I'd had was that the Vampire Chronicles had a lot of gay subtext that the TV show makes more explicit, but no, it's just text. Admittedly, it's near meaningless to try to draw hard lines around which dynamics in these books are or aren't romantic, but if you're determined to do so, you'd have to be willfully ignorant to argue none of the same gender relationships qualify. Vampirism can also read as representing queerness, rather than the two simply existing in the same book. One instance of this that feels heavy-handed to the point I think it must have been unintentional is when, as the first sunrise of Louis's life as a vampire approaches, he refuses to do something as macabre as sleep in a coffin. Surely, he argues, if the point is just to stay out of the sun, any enclosed space will do. I begged Lestat to let me stay in the closet, but he laughed, astonished. "Don't you know what you are?" he asked. Scholar of Gothic fiction George Haggerty, discussing a scene from a later Vampire Chronicles novel, describes the overall vibe well. The lurid exchange of endearments as the blood spurts and the sucking continues hints at the deepest fear behind the vampire's kiss. Not that victims are taken against their will, but rather that the kiss releases the hidden desires that the will would repress. The kiss steals masculinity from itself and refigures it as homoerotic desire. The film is quick to reassure us of Louis' heterosexuality. He's such a straight guy Hollywood protagonist, he has an off-screen dead wife. The subtext, however, remains. Lestat, and Armand for that matter, threatens this heterosexuality, both in being a same-sex life partner, romantic or not, and in his encouraging Louis to stray farther and farther from normal human morality. Normal human morality, in this case, being the morality of the character's own time and social position, where the fact that he owns slaves doesn't seem to factor into the calculation one way or the other. Louis and Lestat end up turning and adopting an orphan girl named Claudia. At one point in the movie, she laments,
"I had a mother once, and Louis, he had a wife."
By making them vampires, Lestat has stolen them from the lives they should have lived in idyllic nuclear families. Before he turns Louis, Lestat says,
"I'm going to give you the choice I never had."
He repeats this at the end of the film when he attacks Malloy, the interviewer of the titular interview. Lestat was made a vampire against his will, and so he gives his potential fledglings a choice. But the kind of joke here is that he only offers this choice after he has drained his victim to the brink of death. If they don't accept, they don't get to keep their human life. They just die. It's consent, but framed in a way that's skeptical of the idea anyone would ever willingly consent to such a horrifying thing. This movie cannot begin to conceive of vampire pride. Louis in the show still does think of it more or less this way.
This is not a life! That's because you took my life!
It is understanding he was mistaken that allows him the possibility of moving forward. Which isn't to say that the televisual version of Lestat has not done wrong. Rather, his crime was never that he turned Louis and Claudia, but instead all the ways he failed them as fellow vampires. Carmen Maria Machado, in her memoir about abuse in a queer relationship, writes, "I think a lot about queer villains, the problem and pleasure and audacity of them. I know I should have a very specific political response to them, and yet, while I recognize the problem intellectually, the system of coding, the way villainy and queerness became a kind of shorthand for each other, I cannot help but love these fictional queer villains. I love them for all their aesthetic lushness and theatrical glee, their fabulousness, their ruthlessness, their power. They're always by far the most interesting characters on the screen. It is not incorrect to tell an artist that there is responsibility tangled up in whom you choose to make villains, but it is also not a simple matter. As it turns out, queer villains become far more interesting among other gay characters. They become one star in a larger constellation. They are put in context. Some of us are unkind, and some of us are confused, and some of us sleep with the wrong people, and some of us make bad decisions, and some of us are murderers. And it sounds terrible, but it is, in fact, freeing. The idea that queer does not equal good or pure or right. It is simply a state of being, one subject to politics, to its own social forces, to larger narratives, to moral complexities of every kind. Even as he helps Claudia plot Lestat's murder, even as he wrestles with all his complicated feelings for the man, Louis notes,
So much would be written about that grim night in New Orleans, but not a single mention of our last hour at Latrobe's. As if the only crime unfit to print took place on that dance floor.
In doing this kind of analysis of an ongoing TV show, I am all too aware that I don't know where the story will land any given idea. Everything I say could end up proving laughably incorrect in future, and this is perhaps never more true than for this show, with its chess game of unreliable narrators. In the third episode, Malloy catches an inconsistency in Louis' story. Mud on Lestat's boots, but...
Was it raining that night? Did it rain?
I don't remember now.
A minor detail. Was it raining, yes or no? But Louis isn't sure of the answer, and so we see both versions. In literature, unreliable narrators are well established as a concept. If we experience events from a given character's point of view, we understand it to be just that, especially when there's an overt framing device like an interview with a vampire. But in film and television, we generally assume that what we're watching play out in front of us is a literal depiction of events. Of course it's true. We were there when it happened. So, to communicate the unreliability of the story we're watching in this show, we have this example, presented to us clearly and early. The rain doesn't matter except for the fact it casts everything else into doubt. We can't begin to answer the important questions when we can't even be sure whether or not it was raining. Louis isn't trying to be unreliable, but in season 2 he is joined as narrator by Armand. Armand, who spent the first season disguised as household staff, always lingering in the background of shots out of focus, the camera itself recruited into his ruse. By the end of season 2, we learn he's been lying to Louis as well. Armand as narrator is deceiving with intent, and he has psychic powers that mean even Louis corroborating his version of events doesn't count for much. In the one instance where Louis knowingly uncovers such manipulation of his memory, he and Armand separately relate the falsified version of events in the exact same phrasing.
Armand could see I was partial to him. Armand preserves my happiness even when you don't or can't. He had a hunch you might prove fruitful in later times.
And that kind of perfect synchrony, like it's scripted, like it's rehearsed, sure does happen at multiple other points in their story.
What were the first words of the ancient vampire to the future love of his life?
He said, I will not harm you.
Describing their first meeting, Armand says,
He was awkward. Thinking he could fade into the landscape, it was absurd.
But then,
he was alarmingly handsome in the muted lamplight.
The delivery of I mean here is just ambiguous enough that it could read either way. I mean in its usage as a kind of filler word emphasizing a statement unrelated to the previous one, or I mean as a correction, I didn't mean that, I meant this, catching himself giving the wrong version of the story. I'm sure I could spend the entire runtime of this video untangling threads like this, but I think that's probably a fool's game. We only know what we've been shown. If some of it can be called into question, all of it can. I have to proceed as if it is, on some level, true, even knowing that could turn out wrong, or else there's nothing for us to talk about.
She writes it here, so let's believe it.
At the beginning of season 2, Louis and Claudia travel Europe in search of other vampires. Claudia is confident they must be out there somewhere, in some faraway place where it's safe to live as themselves. In the essay collection I Hope We Choose Love, Cheng Thom writes that, for young queers, this is the dream that keeps us alive. The dream of a borderless homeland, a place between places full of glitter and drag queens and free condoms and magic. In this fabulous fictional Queerlandia, we are free from the oppression of the often violent and neglectful families and communities where we were raised. In Queerlandia, we imagine, no one is exploited or beaten or raped. No one is excluded, no one is ignored. In Queerlandia, our politics are woke and our words are revolutionary. We are free to love ourselves, to love others, to be loved. Most crucial of all, Queerlandia is the village in its ideal form. Here we like to imagine anything is possible and nothing bad can happen. But of course we do not really live in Queerlandia, though real-life villages and other queer spaces exist aplenty, both physically and on the internet. Real-life queer communities are full of wounded dreamers. How could they not be? They do find other vampires, find Armand and the rest of his coven in Paris. If queer community is measured by the number of wounded among us, I can think of no metaphor that more emphasizes this than the undead. The one thing these people have in common is the experience of what is in real life the ultimate violence. But here they have to keep going and keep living and figuring out who they are to one another after death. Academic Laura Westengard, in their book Gothic Queer Culture, highlights the ways traditional Gothic fiction is often rooted in nostalgia for an idealized past, and parallels this with the narrative of trauma and recovery, which imagines that there is a pre-trauma coherent self to which the recovered subject can return. Like the Gothic narrative's eventual restoration of normative social order after a momentary rupture, this idea of trauma is conservative in that it looks back to an imagined moral past, hoping to erase the anxieties of the present social reality through a return to a place that never actually existed. This traumatic nostalgia, and the Gothic one, refuses to pause in the space of fragmentation and disruption, favoring instead a fantasy of the moral past, the normative subject, the coherent self. As she explains, this contrasts with the insidious trauma of marginalized life, which often involves a barrage of microaggressions over time, rather than any one singular traumatic event. It is, perhaps, a mistake to think of death as a thing which happened to a vampire in the past tense. In the interview with the vampire novel, Armand tells Louis that the difficulties of immortality consist of living past the end of one's own era, that eventually the world becomes so changed from how it was when you were human that life ceases to have any meaning, and sooner or later one succumbs to despair. Of course, the immortal life of the vampire is, at the end of the day, a metaphor for mortal lives. The subject comes up in the context of them discussing Louis' time with Claudia and Lestat as an era of his life now coming to a close. Louis' longing for a literal earlier era of history is bound up in his longing for the era before the personal trauma of his turning. The Gothic nostalgia and the traumatic nostalgia are one and the same. Now, it's likely that Armand via Louis here is, say it with me folks, an unreliable narrator. And when Louis reunites with Lestat toward the end of the book, the latter is this exact vision of a vampire at the end of his rope, flinching from the sounds and sights of modern technology. But when we next meet him in the opening to book 2, he's head over heels in love with the 20th century. So it's perhaps unsurprising that the TV show complicates this idea as well.
Et quand les derniers vestiges de ton époque auront disparu, comment vas-tu survivre à l'éternité?
Jeune homme, there's been a war.
The very premise is suspect, really. When Louis is a gay black man, rather than a vaguely repressed white plantation owner, it feels harder to say with confidence that the period of history he felt most comfortable in must have been the one in which he grew up. In the last moments of Season 2, we see that he now has displayed in his home a painting of his dead brother and the dress belonging to his dead daughter. He is choosing to sit with these tragedies as truths about himself and his life, rather than one-time events that must be moved past. The TV show positioning itself as a pseudo-sequel further emphasizes memory and nostalgia and trauma, and now Daniel Malloy is just as tangled up in them as any of the undead. But his relationship with these things stands in contrast to theirs. That first flashback sequence where we see young Daniel and he's so different but also so the same person, and then he meets Louis and Armand, and they're Louis and Armand. It communicates the uncanny strangeness of immortality better than any amount of period costuming. When Louis brings up having first met Daniel at a gay bar, implying they're both queer, he dismisses it.
It was a good place to score. I did what I had to.
And the flashback sequences don't contradict this. He doesn't seem that interested until after Louis pays for his drink. But I don't know that it matters whether he's quote-unquote actually gay. Systemic homophobia does not distinguish between someone who is having sex with other men because he's attracted to them and someone doing it for other reasons. The bartender at that gay bar knew him by name. He was a part of that queer community. That said, well, young Daniel doesn't necessarily read to me as being interested in Louis. When, after establishing that the two of them did not, in fact, have sex back in the 70s, Louis says,
"You want to now?"
Daniel's face is really something. And given where he ends the season, there's potential for a parallel between him as someone who became a vampire at an older age and someone who comes to a queer identity at an older age. Also,
What's he taste like?
I didn't ask that.
You were thinking it.
okay, sorry, I have a point I'm going to get to, but can I just say, this exchange is absurd on a surface level, right? Like this?
Honey and pineapple. He stuffs himself with both for days before he offers himself to me.
Is a wild thing to say, assuming it's true. But with the subsequent season and a half of context, this scene becomes sublime. Louis is lying. Why is that the lie he goes with? Is this something he has the humans he drinks from do sometimes? Is it just part of his power play with Armand? And then Armand feels the need to make it clear that actually he would never let Daniel drink his blood if he did ask to. Which, first of all, wild thing to specify about your human house guest. I think the lady doth protest too much. And of course, he does end up letting him. Claudia's companion Madeline has similar thoughts as Daniel does here before she's turned.
What's blood taste like?
If we do take vampirism as metaphor for queerness, this is both validation and refutation of the born this way narrative. You're not a vampire unless you're a vampire, but the desire will be there, no matter what you do with it. The boy's face was tense with a mixture of confusion and amazement. "And so you decided to become a vampire?" he asked. The vampire was silent for a moment. Decided. It doesn't seem the right word. Yet I cannot say it was inevitable from the moment that he stepped into that room. No, indeed, it was not inevitable. Yet I can't say I decided. Let me say that when he'd finished speaking, no other decision was possible for me. During his time in Paris, Louis takes up photography. In the present day, he dismisses this as a passing fancy, saying of his photos,
"They document, nothing more."
Which is a hilarious thing to say to someone whose chosen art is journalism. Documentation and craft aren't mutually exclusive. But Louis thinks of them that way, and that's how he's approaching the interview too. Documentation, nothing more. Like his past is a truth trapped in amber he can unearth if he just tries hard enough. Armand is not a photographer. He's a director. He understands what it means to take the story handed to him and make it suit his own purposes. When Louis is showing Daniel his photos, he discovers that Armand has mixed in pictures taken by other people.
Stood on that stage, took all the familiar pieces of Louis's life, defiled them, bent them into a Lestat-shaped effigy.
As they come to the end of their story, Louis and Armand start saying things like,
"Should we begin dinner preparations?"
"Yes, sir." "I do hope you'll join us."
"We have something special prepared for you, Daniel."
And, okay, they were gonna eat him, right? Like, I'm sorry. No matter what else has been said, when the wealthy vampires who've been keeping you locked at the top of their tower start talking about how they sure do hope that you'll join them for dinner, that's what that means. Whether or not it's actually the case in universe, the show wants you to feel like it's a possibility. Louis, I'll believe, was genuine in wanting his story published, but killing Daniel may have been Armand's endgame from the start. Let Louis have this, let him work through whatever he's still processing about San Francisco, but by the time they're done, talk him into cleaning up this loose end. As far as he's concerned, it's all a performance. The Théâtre Les Vampires back on stage this week only for an audience of one. They told you what they were from the beginning. You can hardly be surprised when it ends in bloodshed. I was confident in this read on first viewing, less and less so as I've worked on this video. In particular, the book offers a different, though not incompatible, angle on Armand's motivations. Shortly before the interview, Louis, at his urging, goes to visit Lestat in New Orleans. Afterwards, "I thought perhaps he would tell you something about Paris," Armand said. "What should he say about Paris? That he didn't want Claudia to die?" I asked. "You could have told me anything you wanted about Paris, Armand," I said. "Long before now. It wouldn't have mattered. Even that it was I who..." I turned to him as he lay there looking at the sky, and I saw the extraordinary pain in his face, in his eyes. It seemed his eyes were huge, too huge, and the white face that framed them too gaunt. "That it was you who killed her? Who forced her out into that yard and locked her there?" I asked. I smiled. "Don't tell me you have been feeling pain for it all these years. Not you." And then he closed his eyes and turned his face away, his hand resting on his chest as if I'd struck him an awful, sudden blow. "You care about nothing," he was saying. And then he sat up slowly and turned to me so again I could see that dark fire in his eyes. "I thought you would at least care about that. I thought you would feel the old passion." The show's version of events differs not just in that Louis hasn't already figured out the extent of Armand's involvement in Claudia's death, but that he does have the exact kind of explosive reaction Armand in the book was looking for. And I can't help but wonder if, consciously or not on his part, this Armand was hoping for that outcome too. Louis might feel a lot of different things about him after everything that's happened, but you know what he probably doesn't think?
You're boring! You are so boring!
Claudia's murder, back in Paris, was part of a sham trial the coven put her and Louis through for, nominally, their murder of Lestat. As the twice undead victim describes what happened between them, Louis remembers, and we see a new version of the story played out in front of us. I am sympathetic to those who feel that the end of season 2 veers into abuse apologia. It does kind of feel like the writers don't grasp what it was that made Lestat so terrible, that no amount of showing us Louis' own misdeeds makes a difference to the nature of their relationship, when the power dynamic seems so tilted in Lestat's favor. If nothing else, the fact that he is now the only white character out of the Louis Lestat Armand triangle makes the impending change in point of view a different beast than it was in the books on the level of real-world optics. But I am interested in what it would look like to take that power dynamic seriously, to take that as our starting point and still tell Lestat's story. Another essay in I Hope We Choose Love focuses on queer community's relationship with the Me Too movement. Thom writes of the ways that accusations of violence often lead to consequences only for those a community already considers expendable, which is to say, the most marginalized suffer for wrongdoings those with clout and privilege can shrug off. She writes of how marginalized people are often hesitant to come forward about abuses because of a simultaneous desire to see justice for what was done to them and to protect the people who hurt them from a legal system that does not have either of their best interests at heart. She writes, "What would it take to create a community, a society, a world in which it was safe to tell our stories, where we could melt the ice of our trauma without flooding the land with our grief? We will have to give up our defenses, our time-worn defenses of dissociation and numbness, as well as those of rage and revenge. We have to be able to care, even when it seems impossible, because caring would destroy us. We have to believe that we will survive each other, that we will survive because of each other, because there is something waiting for us when the ice melts." Queer community taught me that. Once. A long time ago. After Armand's lies unravel, Louis finds Lestat, and Lestat's burning question after all these years is not about anything that happened in New Orleans or in Paris. It's about San Francisco. The phrasing of the dialogue transforms the event into something all too human. It's not, "Armand contacted me telepathically. Did you step out into the sunlight despite your vampiric nature?" It's,
Armand called me. Did you hurt yourself?
So many open questions remain in this moment. How much of what happened in Paris was Lestat culpable for? Did Louis get whatever closure he was looking for out of this conversation? Just how much did this show's Apple product placement deal pay? How has time changed Lestat? Who are Louis de Pontelac and Lestat de Liancourt to one another going forward? I don't know the answers to any of these questions. But I can say, with absolute certainty, that it was raining. Hi, thank you for watching. If you like what I'm doing here, you can support me on Patreon. At the $6 a month level, I'm trying to do these little bonus podcast things. And when this video goes public, I'm planning to post one on the Vampire Lestat novel and sort of attendant season 3 speculation. Otherwise, you can stay subscribed right here, and you should hear from me in another month or two, probably about Scavenger's Reign. So I'll talk to you then.